Welcome to the Short Funk Podcast. I'm Tom Barbalet. I woke up this morning and I started to ponder the new podcast that I'm going to be putting out very soon. One of the things associated with successful podcasts, or quote-unquote successful podcasts, is that they have a very active, very promoting, very in-your-face almost fan base that does things that are quite outlandish in order to promote the podcast. And when I think about my listeners, typically Model Rail Radio has some of that element, and I do attribute some of the success of Model Rail Radio to that. But most of my podcasts are generally listened to by folks who are not necessarily standoffish, but they got their own stuff going on. And quite frankly, that's just the way things are. So I wanted to test the idea of let's take the 4th of July and let's make the 4th of July a day to promote independent podcasts. Because the stuff that I do is independent. It's me recording in a room, putting the audio out for you folks to enjoy. There's no sponsors, there are no ideas that could be sponsored. It's just a series of bits and pieces that I kind of throw together and push out onto the internet. In the case of Model Rail Radio, obviously there's some degree of formality. In the case of Stone Ape, there's less formality. But Short Funk represents the least formal of my podcasting formats in one regard, but also the most formal in terms of the general performance. My interest really is to see, of the existing listeners that I have, how many would be willing to go and promote a particular recording, a particular episode of something that I've done, and flag this as being something that they thoroughly enjoy. You'll note that I didn't do this in Short Funk, and I didn't do it in Short Funk primarily because I'm interested in using a new technique with Short Funk. What I've started to do is add both Twitter and Facebook links to my various podcasts, which means if someone likes a particular episode, if they're listening, they can just move through, select that particular recording, and then immediately promote it through Facebook or Twitter, maybe with some message attached. You might realize, as I come to this realization, that I'm starting to understand the utility of services like Twitter here. Yes, I had been relatively satirical in my clowning of Apple associated with this is not the way that you promote podcasts. But I thought if this is one vehicle that is there at least, maybe I might utilize it as much as possible to try and link it with getting positive information out about the podcasts that I record. It was extraordinarily difficult to navigate through the podcast linking standards, in particular how to do this on a mobile device. On a mobile device, I still haven't broken the means of getting from a link click to an app. It always goes through Safari. You do have some luck on Facebook, I think, if you go through the Facebook interface where somehow you're playing a podcast through Facebook, the app. You can then click on the podcast link, and somehow it'll bring you back to linking it directly on the Facebook app. So unbelievably convoluted, but still no way to get out of the Safari ecosystem. I'm not sure how it works on Android products, but still a very clunky interface in order to get someone to say, I really like this podcast here, friends, why don't you have a listen to it as well? And that's ultimately what I'm looking for going forwards. In this light, I will try a variety of different techniques, which I'm looking to optimize in Short Funk specifically, to get people to just communicate. This podcast has been important, this podcast has shown insights, this podcast is something that I think you should listen to as well. And within that context, because of Short Funk format, the Short Funk format being very brief, my hope is that people will be receptive to this and share it, and people will pick up the various ideas through these podcasts too. Please feel free to give me feedback either through Twitter, Facebook, or email, and I will optimize this stuff accordingly. Through the initial post, a number of folks in the Model Rail Radio community commented and gave feedback associated with this, but I think in the medium term, with some tuning, it should be relatively accessible to people, so when they hear a podcast that they like, they just click on the link provided and they can go through and tweet it or put it on Facebook. Email is always another possibility, in particular because so many of my podcasts have eclectic listeners that don't participate in social media actively. With that, the link, click, copying the link, using the link provided, all that kind of stuff works as well. What I'm looking for here is not an exponential growth or a rapid growth, but just something to say this thing actually worked. I reflect on my experiences of podcasting over the past decade. The podcast that comes to mind is The Mind of Men. The Mind of Men basically threatened their listeners that said that if they didn't get a doubling of listeners in, I think, a month or two period, they would stop podcasting. That's not a threat I'm making here. All I'm looking to do is see if I can move the growth more towards the kind of linear set, and perhaps a better linear set that indicates word-of-mouth recommendations, things that keep people coming to the site, coming to the podcasts, getting things new, and just seeing if this format can work so when I launch my new podcast, I can start experimenting with this more tuned approach. Tom Barbalet in San Jose, signing out.